In the summer of 1944, German intelligence was tracking a full American armored division moving through France. Tanks, artillery, thousands of men. They reported its position. They adjusted their defenses around it. They feared it. The division did not exist. What the Germans were tracking was 1,100 men with inflatable rubber tanks, loudspeakers playing recorded tank sounds from 15 miles away, and radio operators sending fake messages in the Morse code styles of officers who were somewhere else entirely. Half of those 1,100 men were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were painters, sculptors, actors, and advertising executives, because the men who planned this understood something no military manual had ever written down. The most powerful weapon in France in 1944 was not a tank or a gun, it was a convincing performance, and for 50 years after the war ended, the men who gave that performance could not tell anyone what they had done, not their wives, not their children, not anyone. The operation was classified. Some of them died before the secret was released. The unit that saved thousands of American lives was not allowed to exist in history. To understand why the Ghost Army was possible, you have to understand the problem it was created to solve. And that problem was simple and brutal. You cannot be everywhere at once. By the summer of 1944, the Allied campaign in France was moving faster than anyone had planned. The breakout from Normandy had succeeded. German lines were stretched, retreating, looking desperately for weaknesses in the Allied advance. And wherever a weakness existed, wherever a gap opened between one Allied unit and the next, German forces would push through it. The consequences of a successful German counterattack through a gap in the line could be catastrophic. Thousands of men exposed, supply lines cut, an entire advance reversed. The solution to a gap in the line was simple in theory: fill it with troops. But troops were not always available. Units were exhausted, resupplying, repositioning. The front moved faster than the logistics could follow. And so an idea that had been developing in military planning circles since before D-Day was put into practice. If you could not fill a gap with real soldiers, fill it with the appearance of soldiers. Make the Germans believe the gap was not a gap at all. The unit assigned to make this happen was the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, activated in January 1944 and known to almost nobody outside the small circle of officers who planned its operations. It was unlike any military unit ever assembled. When the Army began recruiting for the 23rd, it did not look primarily for combat experience or physical fitness. It looked for artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, men who understood how to create an illusion convincing enough to fool trained military observers from a distance. The recruitment pipeline ran through art schools, advertising agencies, theater programs, and radio studios. Among the men who eventually served in the unit were Ellsworth Kelly, who became one of the most important American abstract painters of the 20th century, and Bill Blass, who became one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. These men were given rifles they barely knew how to use, uniforms that belonged to units they had nothing to do with, and a mission that no military training manual had ever described. They were divided into 4 specialized companies, each responsible for a different element of the deception. The first was visual deception. This company operated the inflatable equipment, rubber tanks, rubber artillery pieces, rubber trucks and jeeps, all manufactured to look convincingly real from the altitude at which German reconnaissance aircraft flew. Each inflatable tank required a team of men to carry it, position it, inflate it, and arrange it in patterns that matched how a real armored unit would park its vehicles. Up close, the rubber was obvious. From 2,000 feet, through a camera lens, it was a tank. The team learned to work fast, setting up an entire fake armored camp in hours, then breaking it down and moving before German ground forces could get close enough to investigate. The second was sonic deception. This company operated half-track vehicles fitted with powerful amplifiers and large speaker arrays. They had spent months in the United States recording the sounds of real armored units, tank engines starting, treads moving over different terrain, the particular mechanical noise of different vehicle types at different speeds. These recordings could be played through the amplifiers at volumes loud enough to be heard 15 miles away. A sonic team positioned beyond a ridgeline could convince an entire German division that an armored column was approaching from behind the hill. The timing and sequencing of the sounds was planned like a theatrical score. The third was radio deception. This was perhaps the most technically demanding element of the operation. Every radio operator in the Army had an individual style, a particular rhythm and pattern to their Morse code transmissions that experienced listeners could identify as reliably as a fingerprint. German signals intelligence had been listening to American radio traffic for months and had built profiles of the operators in key units. If a division suddenly went silent and a new set of operators appeared on the same frequencies, the Germans would know something had changed. The Ghost Army's radio operators spent weeks studying the transmission styles of the operators they were replacing, learning to mimic every individual quirk and habit. When the 23rd moved into position to replace a real unit, its radio operators stepped onto the air in the voices of the men they were imitating. The Germans heard the same operators they had always heard. Nothing had changed. The fourth element was what the unit called atmosphere. Ghost Army soldiers dressed in the uniforms and insignia of whatever unit they were impersonating and moved through nearby towns, visited cafes, talked loudly in public places about where they were going and what they were doing. They understood that local civilians talked to German agents. That information leaked through occupied France in a dozen ways. The conversations they had in public were part of the deception as much as the rubber tanks in the fields. Let me put you inside that operation for a moment. It is September 1944. You are a radio operator with the 23rd, and for the past 3 days you have been transmitting as Corporal James Whitfield of the 2nd Armored Division. You have studied Whitfield's transmission style for 2 weeks. You know the slight hesitation he makes before certain letters, the particular rhythm of his spacing, the way he abbreviates certain standard phrases. You have never met him. He is 50 miles to the north, doing his actual job, unaware that someone is speaking in his voice. Outside your vehicle, your colleagues are inflating rubber Sherman tanks in a field that was empty this morning. A sonic half-track is positioned 2 ridgelines over, playing the sound of an armored column moving into position. 3 men in 2nd Armored patches are drinking coffee at a cafe in the nearest village, talking just loudly enough about the division's next objective. And somewhere across the front line, a German intelligence officer is updating his map. The 2nd Armored Division is here. He is certain of it. He has radio confirmation, acoustic confirmation, visual confirmation from his reconnaissance aircraft. He adjusts the defensive dispositions of his unit accordingly. He is protecting against a threat that does not exist. 50 miles away, the real American advance is moving through the gap he just left unguarded. The Ghost Army conducted 21 deception operations between 1944 and 1945, ranging from the fields of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine. Each operation was different. Each required the unit to study a new target, build a new illusion, and maintain it long enough for real American forces to exploit the confusion it created. Military historians who have studied the operations estimate that the deceptions saved tens of thousands of American lives by drawing German forces away from actual Allied movements. But here is the part that defines the Ghost Army's place in history. And it is the part that most people who have heard of the unit still do not fully understand. For 50 years, none of it was acknowledged. The men of the 23rd were told when they went home that what they had done was classified and that they were not to speak of it to anyone, ever. This was not an unusual instruction in 1945. Hundreds of wartime operations remained classified for years, but the Ghost Army's secrecy lasted longer than almost anything else from the war. Veterans went home, started careers, raised families, grew old. When people asked what they had done in the war, they said they had been in the army in Europe. Some said they had been in a headquarters unit. None of them said what they had actually done. Ellsworth Kelly went on to become one of the most celebrated artists in America. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. Neither spoke publicly about their wartime service for decades. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially declassified in 1996, 51 years after the war ended. By that time, many of the men who had served in it were dead. The ones who were still alive were in their 70s and 80s. And for the first time they could sit down with their children and grandchildren and explain what they had actually done during those years when the world was at war. The Ghost Army received a Congressional Gold Medal in 2022, the highest civilian honor the United States Congress can award, 77 years after the operation ended. Modern military deception, psychological operations, information warfare, all of it traces a direct line back to what those 1,100 men worked out in the fields of France in 1944. The understanding that perception can be as powerful as force, that an enemy who believes something false will act on that belief as surely as if it were true, is now central to how every major military in the world plans its operations. The painters and the actors and the advertising men figured that out first. With rubber tanks and loudspeakers and the practiced rhythm of another man's Morse code, they sent painters and actors to stop German tanks. The painters and actors did exactly that, and then they went home and said nothing for half a century. The army that never existed saved the men who did.